Commander Daniel Cole stepped off the transport shuttle and onto the deck of the HFY flagship Eternal Dawn. Carrying nothing but a single duffel bag and 17 years of combat experience burned into his bones. The ship was unlike anything he had seen in his 15 years with the United Earth Defense Corps, and the walls seemed to breathe with a soft blue light that pulsed like a living heartbeat, while the corridors stretched impossibly wide. Designed for beings who stood 8 feet tall and moved with the grace of dancers, Daniel was not a tall man by human standards. And among the HFY, he felt almost childlike. But he had learned long ago that size meant nothing when bullets started flying. A young HFY officer met him at the airlock, her silver blue skin shimmering under the ambient lighting, and her eyes shifting from deep purple to pale gold as she looked him over with barely concealed disappointment. "You are the human guard," she said. And it was not a question, but a statement of fact laced with something that sounded almost like pity. Daniel nodded once and said nothing, because he had discovered that silence often told him more about people than words ever could. The officer led him through winding corridors, filled with HFY who stopped their conversations to stare at the small human walking among them, and Daniel felt their gazes like physical weight on his shoulders. But he kept his eyes forward and his expression neutral. They arrived at a set of massive doors carved with symbols that Daniel could not read, and the officer touched a panel that glowed at her approach. "The princess will receive you now," she said. Stepping aside with obvious relief at being rid of him, Daniel walked through the doors and into a room that took his breath away. Despite his best efforts to remain unimpressed, the chamber was vast, with ceilings that disappeared into darkness above and walls lined with crystalline formations that sang softly when the air moved. And at the center of it all stood Princess Villani of the HFY Dominion. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with human standards, her silver blue skin marked with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like water, and her eyes were the deep violet of a dying star. Ancient and knowing and utterly uninterested in the human who had just entered her presence. "So you are my new guardian," she said, her voice carrying across the chamber like music played on instruments that did not exist on Earth. Daniel bowed his head slightly, not in subservience but in respect, and replied that he was honored to serve. The princess made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been dismissal, and she turned away to gaze out a massive window that showed the stars streaming past as the ship traveled through space. "My advisor, Lord Mythos, will explain your duties," she said without looking back, "though I expect they will not be demanding, as this assignment is merely political theater designed to appease your species." Daniel said nothing to this, because there was nothing useful to say, and silence had always been his greatest weapon. Lord Mythos found him an hour later in the small quarters he had been assigned, a room barely large enough for the narrow bed and tiny desk it contained. And the HFY noble made no effort to hide his contempt. "You understand that this position is ceremonial," Mythos said, his violet robes rustling as he clasped his long fingers behind his back. "And the princess has a full complement of royal guards who have trained for centuries to protect her. So your presence is nothing more than a symbol of the Concordat's misguided, attempted inclusion." Daniel listened without reaction and then asked about patrol schedules, security protocols, and emergency evacuation routes. Mythos stared at him for a long moment, his eyes shifting to a color Daniel could not name, and then provided the information with obvious reluctance before leaving without another word. That night, Daniel did not sleep. Instead, he walked the corridors of the Eternal Dawn, memorizing every turn and every access point, counting the guards and noting their positions, identifying the places where an attacker might hide and the routes that would provide the fastest escape. The HFY guards watched him with amusement as he passed, whispering to each other in their musical language, And Daniel pretended not to notice while filing away every detail for later analysis. By morning, he had identified 17 security gaps that the Cathari had overlooked, probably because they had not faced a serious threat in centuries. And he began to understand why the Dominion had requested a human bodyguard. Even if they did not respect the species they had asked for help. The Goodwill Tour began 3 days later, with the Eternal Dawn jumping to the first of 12 systems that Princess Vellani would visit over the coming months. And Daniel took his position 3 steps behind her as she greeted dignitaries from species he had never heard of. He watched the crowds with the eyes of a predator, scanning for threats, for unusual movement, for the subtle signs that something was wrong. While the princess smiled and spoke words of peace and cooperation that sounded rehearsed but sincere, days turned into weeks, and Daniel maintained his silent vigil without complaint, eating when he could and sleeping in short bursts, always ready to move at a moment's notice. The Cathari guards began to ignore him entirely, treating him as nothing more than furniture. But Daniel noticed that Princess Vellani had started to glance at him during quiet moments, curiosity flickering in her ever-changing eyes. One evening, as the ship traveled between systems, she approached him in the corridor outside her quarters. "You never speak unless spoken to," she said. Her head tilted slightly as she studied him. "And you never rest. Yet you never seem tired. So tell me, human, what drives you to take this duty so seriously when everyone around you treats it as a joke?" Daniel considered the question carefully before answering that he had sworn an oath to protect her, and that an oath meant the same thing whether anyone believed in it or not. The princess was silent for a long moment, and then she did something that Daniel had not expected. She smiled, and it was not the practiced diplomatic smile she wore for crowds, but something smaller and more real. "You are strange," she said softly, "and I do not understand your kind at all. But I think perhaps that is the point." She returned to her quarters without another word, and Daniel resumed his watch. But something had shifted between them. Some barrier had cracked, and he knew that the assignment he had accepted as a retirement posting had become something far more complicated. What he did not know, as he stood guard in the humming corridors of an alien ship, was that forces were already moving against the princes he had sworn to protect, and that the coming months would test him in ways he could not possibly imagine. The stars streamed past the observation windows, beautiful and cold and indifferent, and Daniel Cole kept watch through the long night, waiting for a danger he could not yet name, but could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. The weeks passed slowly aboard the Eternal Dawn as the Goodwill Tour carried Princess Vellani through system after system, and Daniel Cole settled into a routine that would have broken most men but felt almost comfortable to someone who had spent years in combat zones. He woke before the princess each morning, checked the corridors for anything unusual, reviewed the schedule for the day, and positioned himself exactly 3 steps behind her whenever she appeared in public. The Cathari guards had stopped noticing him entirely, speaking freely in his presence as if he were deaf or simply too primitive to understand. And Daniel let them believe whatever made them comfortable while he listened to everything they said. He learned that the Eternal Dawn was not simply a diplomatic vessel, but the pride of the Cathari fleet, capable of devastating entire planets if necessary. And he learned that the crew considered their assignment to be an honor. Beyond measure, he also learned that not everyone aboard the ship was happy about the direction the Dominion was taking. Under the influence of its youngest Princess Vellani, had become known throughout the galaxy as a voice for unity, speaking often about the need for the ancient species to welcome newer ones like humanity into full partnership. And this made her beloved among reformers, but despised by those who clung to the old ways. The purists, they called themselves. And they believed that the Cathari had grown weak through contact with lesser races. Daniel heard their name whispered in corridors late at night, always with reverence by some and fear by others. And he began to piece together a picture that troubled him deeply. The princess herself seemed unaware of the danger. Or perhaps she was simply better at hiding her fear than Daniel had expected. Their conversations grew longer as the tour progressed, with Vailani seeking him out during quiet moments to ask questions about Earth and humanity that no Kethari had ever bothered to ask. She wanted to know about human music and human art, about the wars they had fought and the peace they had built, about the way they loved and grieved and celebrated. Daniel answered as honestly as he could, painting a picture of a species that was young and foolish, and sometimes cruel, but also capable of extraordinary kindness. Your people have only traveled among the stars for 2 centuries, Vailani said one evening as they stood together in the observation lounge, watching a nebula drift past like colored smoke. Yet you have already changed the galaxy more than species who have existed for millennia. Daniel shrugged and replied that humans were stubborn and refused to accept that anything was impossible. The princess laughed at this, a genuine sound that made several nearby attendants look up in surprise. And Daniel felt something warm in his chest that he immediately pushed aside as unprofessional. But even as their friendship grew, Daniel could not ignore the warning signs that multiplied around him like shadows at sunset. Lord Mithras had begun holding private meetings with select members of the crew, always in quarters that were shielded from surveillance. And the route of the tour had been subtly altered to bring them closer to the border territories where Concordat authority was weakest. Daniel started sleeping outside the princess's quarters with his sidearm in his hand, telling himself it was simply caution, while knowing in his gut that something terrible was coming. He tried to warn Vailani one night, choosing his words carefully to avoid sounding paranoid. There are people on this ship who do not wish you well, he said quietly as they walked through a deserted corridor. And I believe they may be planning something during the remainder of the tour. The princess stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes shifting through colors he had never seen before. And for a long moment she said nothing at all. I know, she finally whispered. And the fear he had sensed in her from the very beginning was suddenly visible on her face. And I have known for longer than I care to admit, but I cannot act without proof. And the forces arrayed against me are more powerful than you understand. Daniel felt cold fury rise in his chest at the thought that she had been living with this threat alone. And he asked why she had not told anyone. Because I do not know who to trust, Alani replied, her voice barely audible. And the only person on this ship who has no reason to want me dead is a human bodyguard that everyone dismisses as a political decoration. She reached out and touched his arm, her fingers cool against his skin, and Daniel saw tears forming in her ancient eyes. You see me, she said softly, not as a princess or a symbol or a prize to be won, but as a person who is frightened and alone. And you have no idea how rare that is among my own kind. Daniel covered her hand with his own and made her a promise that he knew might cost him everything. I will not let them hurt you, he said. And he meant every word with a conviction that surprised even himself. The princess nodded slowly and withdrew her hand, composing herself with the practice of centuries. And when she spoke again, her voice was steady. The Volantis system, she said. That is where they will make their move. Because the station there is far from any Concordat fleet, and the crowd will make it easy for an assassin to disappear. Daniel asked how she could be certain, and Vailani smiled sadly, because Lord Mithras does not realize that I can read the communications he thinks are encrypted, she replied. And I have been watching him betray me for months while searching desperately for allies who might help me survive. She looked at Daniel with an expression that made his heart ache. I had almost given up hope when you arrived, she admitted. And I thought you were just another guard who would stand by uselessly while my enemies closed in. But I was wrong about you, and I have never been so grateful to be wrong. Daniel told her that they needed to contact Earth immediately to bring in reinforcements, to expose the conspiracy before it could strike, but Vellani shook her head and explained that the Purists had allies throughout the Concordat and that any attempt to call for help would be intercepted and used as proof that she was unstable. The only way to stop them is to let them make their attempt and fail, she said. And that means trusting you to do what no one believes a human can do. Daniel understood then what she was asking of him, and he felt the weight of it settle onto his shoulders like armor he had worn 1,000 times before. He was going to save her life or die trying. And either way, the galaxy would never be the same. They parted in the corridor outside her quarters, and Daniel took up his position for another long night of watching and waiting. The stars outside the observation windows seemed colder than before, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper. And somewhere on the ship, Lord Methus was finalizing plans that he believed were secret. But Daniel Cole had fought enemies far more dangerous than traitorous nobles, and he had never lost anyone under his protection. He did not intend to start now. The orbital station above Valantis Prime was a marvel of engineering that had taken 3 species working together nearly a century to complete. And on the day of the diplomatic reception, it was filled with delegates from across the galaxy who had come to celebrate the opening of a new trade corridor. Daniel Cole stood in his usual position 3 steps behind Princess Vellani, his eyes moving constantly across the crowded reception hall as he catalogued every face and every movement. He had not slept in 4 days. The princess was radiant in ceremonial robes of deep violet that seemed to capture starlight and hold it against her skin. And she moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who had attended 10,000 such gatherings. But Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders and the slight tremor in her hands that she hid by clasping them before her. And he knew that she was waiting for the blow to fall just as he was. Lord Methus circulated nearby, his oily smile directed at dignitaries who had no idea that they were speaking to a traitor. And Daniel watched him exchange meaningful glances with several of the Cathari Royal Guards. Captain Sorrel was the one Daniel watched most closely, a tall warrior with eyes the color of frozen steel who had always seemed slightly too interested in the princess's schedule and slightly too casual about security protocols. Daniel had marked him as dangerous from the first day, and now he could see the way Sorrel positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, always maintaining a clear line of sight. The Villain of Reception proceeded through its formal stages, with speeches about cooperation and prosperity that Daniel barely heard as he tracked potential threats throughout the room. A human diplomat tried to engage him in conversation, curious about what it was like to serve aboard a Cathari vessel. But Daniel deflected with monosyllabic answers and kept his attention on the crowd. The moment came an hour into the reception, when Vellani had moved to a raised platform to address the assembled delegates about her vision for a more unified galaxy. Daniel saw Sorrel begin to move. The captain pushed through the crowd with purpose, his right hand reaching beneath his formal robes for something hidden there. And Daniel's body was already in motion before his mind finished processing what was happening. Time slowed the way it always did in combat, each second stretching like taffy as Daniel's training took over completely. He calculated the distance to Sorrel and knew immediately that he could not reach the assassin in time to stop him. But he could reach Vellani, and that was all that mattered. Sorrel drew his weapon, a plasma blade that ignited with a hiss audible even above the murmur of the crowd. And screams began to erupt as delegates realized what was happening. Daniel threw himself forward with every ounce of strength in his body. He hit Vellani from behind, wrapping his arms around her and spinning them both away from the assassin's strike. And he felt the plasma blade punch through his back and out through his chest in a burst of agony that whited out his vision. They fell together, the princess and her human guardian. Tumbling off the platform and onto the polished floor below, Daniel heard Vylani screaming his name as if from a great distance. And he felt her hands pressing against the wound in his chest, as if she could somehow hold his life inside his body through sheer force of will. Pain was extraordinary, a fire that consumed everything from the inside out. But Daniel forced his eyes to focus on her face above him. Her eyes were cycling through colors faster than he had ever seen. Emotions he could not name flickering across her features, and tears were streaming down her silver blue cheeks. "Stay with me," she begged, her voice cracking with desperation. "You cannot leave me now, not after everything. Not like this." Daniel tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth, and he could only cough. Weakly around them, the reception hall had erupted into chaos, with guards from a dozen species converging on Captain Sorrel, while delegates fled in every direction. Daniel heard someone shouting for a medical team, and someone else shouting that the assassin had been subdued. But none of it seemed important anymore. The only thing that mattered was Vylani's face above him, beautiful and terrified, and filled with a grief that seemed far too large for someone she had known for only a few months. "Why?" she whispered, and the word carried all the weight of her 300 years. "Why would you do this for me when my own people would not?" Daniel managed to smile despite the blood on his lips. "And he found the strength for a few final words, because you are worth saving," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And because someone had to show them what humans are made of." Vylani shook her head violently, refusing to accept what was happening, and she pressed harder against his wound as if denial could reverse the damage that had already been done. "You cannot die," she insisted, her voice rising to something like a wail. "I forbid it, do you hear me? I am a princess of the Cathari Dominion, and I forbid you to die." Daniel wanted to laugh at the absurdity of someone trying to command death, but he could feel the darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision, and he knew he had very little time left. He reached up with a hand that felt impossibly heavy and touched her face, leaving a smear of red on her silver blue cheek. "Protect them," he said. And he was no longer sure if he meant the humans who would need a champion in the years to come, or the Cathari, who had never learned to see his species as equals, or simply everyone, everywhere, who deserved someone willing to stand between them and the darkness, protect all of them. Vylani grabbed his hand and held it against her face, her tears mixing with his blood. And Daniel Cole looked into her ever-changing eyes one final time. He saw grief there, and rage, and something that might have been love, though he would never know for certain. He saw the future too, stretching out before her like an endless road. And he knew that she would walk it well, because she was stronger than she believed. "Thank you," he whispered. And then the darkness came for him, and he did not fight it. Daniel Cole died on the cold floor of an orbital station, 6,000 light years from Earth, in the arms of an alien princess he had come to consider a friend. He was 47 years old, and he had no family waiting for him back home, no children to carry his name, number legacy, except the oath he had sworn and kept. But in his final moments, he was not alone. And perhaps that was enough. Vylani held his body for a long time after he stopped breathing, rocking back and forth, and keening in the ancient language of her people, while the chaos of the reception continued around her. No one dared to approach, not even Lord Mythos, who stood frozen at the edge of the crowd with the look of a man who had just realized that his perfect plan had gone terribly wrong. Human was supposed to be irrelevant, a decoration, a symbol. He was not supposed to matter. But looking at the princess cradling his body as if it were the most precious thing in the universe, every being in that reception hall understood that somehow, impossibly, he had mattered more than any of them. The news spread across the galaxy like wildfire through dry grass, carried by every communication network and broadcast. On every station from the core worlds to the frontier colonies, human had died. Saving an alien princess, the footage from the reception was played millions of times in the hours following the assassination attempt, and viewers from 100 different species watched Daniel Cole throw himself into the path of a plasma blade meant for Princess Valanathi, watched him fall with the weapon still burning in his chest. And they watched the princess catch him in her arms. And they watched his final moments as he touched her face and spoke words that no microphone had been close enough to capture. Commentators across the galaxy struggled to explain what they had witnessed. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 2 centuries, barely a heartbeat by the standards of older species. And they had always been viewed as crude and primitive and ultimately insignificant. But this human had given his life for someone who was not his own kind, for someone who came from a species that had treated humanity as useful tools at best and amusing pets at worst. Why would anyone do such a thing on Earth? The reaction was immediate and overwhelming, with millions gathering in public squares to honor a man most of them had never heard of before that day. Daniel Cole had no surviving family, but the entire planet claimed him as their own, and his picture appeared on screens in every city, alongside headlines that declared him a hero. On the find, Eternal Dawn Princess Valani refused to leave his body. She sat with him in the medical bay for 3 days, while her attendants begged her to observe proper protocols, to let the humans collect their dead, to return to her duties as a representative of the Dominion. She refused them all. He gave everything for me, she said when Lord Mythos dared to suggest that her behavior was unseemly. And you want me to hand him off to strangers, as if he were cargo to be disposed of. Her eyes had changed since the assassination attempt, the colors moving more slowly and settling more often on shades of deep blue that the Cathari associated with profound sorrow. Lord Mythos tried again to convince her to move on, speaking of diplomatic obligations and the need to project strength. And Valani finally looked at him with an expression that made him take 3 steps backward. I know what you did, she said quietly, and her voice carried more threat than 1,000 shouted accusations. I know about your meetings with Captain Sorrel and your encrypted communications with the Purist Council. And I know that you meant for me to die on that station. Mythos opened his mouth to deny everything, but no words came out. The only reason you are still breathing, Valani continued in that same quiet voice, is because I need you alive to testify against the others. But make no mistake, when this is over, you will face justice for every life your conspiracy has cost, including the life of the only person on this ship who actually cared whether I lived or died. She turned back to Daniel's body and dismissed Mythos with a wave of her hand. And the once powerful lord stumbled out of the medical bay with the look of a man who had just seen his own execution. The investigation moved swiftly after Thet Valani provided evidence she had been gathering for months. Encrypted communications and financial records and testimony from crew members who had been coerced into supporting the Purists. Lord Mythos was arrested within a week, along with 17 other conspirators from across the Dominion. And the trial that followed was broadcast across the entire Concordat. But the trial was only part of the transformation that Daniel Cole's death had set in motion. Violently addressed the High Council of the Cathari Dominion in a speech that historians would study for centuries afterward. We have called ourselves the wisest of the galactic species, she said, standing alone before the assembled elders who governed her people. And we have looked down upon younger races as if they were children playing at civilization. She paused, and the silence in the council chamber was absolute. But a human showed me more wisdom in a few months than I have learned in 3 centuries of life among my own kind. She spoke of Daniel's quiet competence and his refusal to be intimidated by those who dismissed him. She spoke of his willingness to see her as a person rather than a symbol, and his determination to keep his oath even when no one believed it mattered. She spoke of the moment he had stepped between her and death, without hesitation, trading his life for hers as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. "This is what humans are," Vellani declared, her voice ringing through the chamber. "Not primitives to be tolerated, not tools to be used, but beings of extraordinary courage and loyalty who deserve to stand beside us as equals." The reforms she demanded were unprecedented in the history of the Dominion. Humans were elevated from associate members to full partners in the Galactic Concordat. With all the rights and responsibilities that status entailed, trade restrictions that had limited human commerce for generations were lifted, and human students were admitted to Cathari academies for the first time in history. Human ships were welcomed in ports that had been closed to them, and human diplomats were granted access to councils that had never before heard a human voice. There was resistance. Of course, the purists and their sympathizers fought every change with the desperation of those who see their world ending. But they were fighting against a tide that could not be stopped. The image of Daniel Cole, dying in the princess's arms, had become a symbol that transcended politics. A proof that humans were not what the old prejudices had claimed, and at the center of it all stood Vellani, transformed by grief into something fiercer and more determined than she had ever been. She had lost the one person who had truly seen her, and she would honor his memory by changing the galaxy that had failed them both on the day of Daniel's memorial service, held in the Grand Plaza of Volantis Prime, where thousands of beings from dozens of species had gathered. Vellani spoke a final tribute to the man who had saved her life. "He asked me to protect them," she said, and her voice carried across the plaza and across the galaxy through countless broadcast networks. "And I did not understand at first who he meant." She looked out at the crowd, at the humans weeping openly and the Cathari standing in respectful silence, and the representatives of species who had never cared about humanity before this moment. "Now I know," she said. He meant everyone. She placed a single white flower on the memorial that had been erected in Daniel's honor, a simple stone marker that bore his name and the words he had spoken with his final breath: "Protect all of them. I will keep his promise," Vellani said softly, speaking now to the man who could no longer hear her. "For as long as I live, I will keep his promise." The crowd stood in silence as she walked away. And something had changed in the galaxy that would never change. Back, a human had died for an alien princess, and nothing would ever be the same. 50 years had passed since the day Daniel Cole died on the orbital station above Volantis Prime, and the galaxy had transformed beyond recognition. Statues stood in the Grand Plaza, where his memorial service had been held half a century before. A towering sculpture of bronze and crystal that depicted a human man with arms outstretched, shielding a Cathari woman from an unseen threat. The inscription at the base was written in 17 languages, one for each species that had put his story as part of their own heritage. Here fell Daniel Cole of Earth, who taught us that courage knows no species. Empress Vellani I arrived at the plaza just as the twin sons of Volantis began their descent toward the horizon. Casting long shadows across the polished stone, she came alone, as she did every year on this anniversary, without guards or attendants or the endless entourage that usually surrounded the most powerful being in the Concordat. The people in the plaza recognized her immediately, of course, but they kept their distance out of respect for the private grief that had become public ritual. Vellani had changed since ascending to the throne 30 years ago, her face marked by the weight of leadership and the passage of time. But her eyes still shifted through the same colors they always had, and they still settled on deep blue. When she looked at the statue, she carried a single white rose in her hands, grown in the memorial garden she had established on her homeworld, where 100 different species of flowers bloomed in honor of the man who had saved her life. Rose was Earth's contribution to that garden, and it had become her tradition to bring one here each year. She knelt at the base of the statue, and placed the flower among the dozens of others that visitors had left throughout the day. And then she simply stayed there for a while, looking up at the face she had never forgotten. "The historians are writing books about you again," she said softly, speaking to him as she had done every year for 5 decades. "And they still do not understand why you did what you did." She smiled slightly, the expression carrying both warmth and sadness. "They write about political implications and shifting power dynamics and the economic factors that led to human integration. But they miss the simple truth that you could have told them if you had lived." She stood slowly, her joints protesting the movement in ways they never had when she was young. And she brushed dust from her simple traveling clothes. "You did it because it was right," she said. "Not because you expected the galaxy to change, not because you wanted to be remembered, but because someone you cared about was in danger and you could not stand by and do nothing." The plaza was quiet around her, the usual crowds keeping their distance. And Vellani took a moment to look around at the city that had grown up since Daniel's death-human architecture stood alongside HFY designs now, the two styles blending in ways that would have been unthinkable. A century ago, human children played in parks designed by alien landscapers, and HFY students walked to academies where human professors taught alongside instructors from a dozen other species. The integration Daniel had made possible was visible everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life so completely that young people could not imagine a galaxy where humans were considered inferior. "Your people sit on the High Council now," Vellani told the statue, "and a human woman serves as my chief advisor. The first of your species to hold that position in the history of the Dominion." She laughed quietly, imagining what Daniel would have thought of that development. "She reminds me of you sometimes. The way she speaks plainly and refuses to treat me like I am made of glass. And I suspect that is why I chose her for the role." A young couple walked past at a respectful distance, a human man and a HFY woman holding hands as they strolled through the plaza. They paused to look at the statue for a moment, clearly tourists visiting the famous memorial, and then continued on their way without recognizing the Empress, who stood in the shadow of her old friend. Vellani watched them go with something like wonder in her eyes. Marriages between humans and HFY had become common in the decades since the integration laws had passed, producing children who carried the best of both species. The purists had warned that such mixing would dilute the strength of the HFY people, but they had been proven catastrophically wrong. The hybrid children were stronger and healthier than either parent species, their immune systems more robust, and their minds more adaptable. Evolution, it seemed, favored those who embraced change rather than those who feared it. "I kept my promise," Vellani said, turning back to the statue, "and I protected them, all of them, just as you asked." She touched the cold bronze of his outstretched hand, remembering how warm his real hand had felt when he touched her face in his final moments. "I am old now, Daniel, older than you ever knew I could be. And I will not be Empress forever." Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied it with the practice of years. "But the galaxy you helped create will continue long after I am gone, and your name will be remembered when the stars themselves have faded." She stepped back from the statue and looked at it one final time as the suns continued their descent and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Thank you," she said simply, the same words she had spoken every year for 50 years. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for staying when everyone else would have left. Thank you for teaching me what it means to love someone enough to die for them." She turned and walked away from the statue, moving slowly through the plaza toward the transport that would take her back to her duties and her responsibilities and her endless work. But she paused at the edge of the plaza and looked back one more time at the figure frozen in bronze, arms stretched out to protect someone who was no longer there. Historians would never truly understand what had happened that day. She knew they would analyze political movements and economic factors and the shifting balance of power. And they would miss the simple truth at the heart of it all. The galaxy had changed because one ordinary man had made an extraordinary choice. He had loved someone enough to give everything for her. And that love had rippled outward through the years like waves from a stone. Dropped in still water, it had touched species who had never met him and inspired generations who had never heard his voice. And it had proven something that the oldest civilizations had forgotten. The measure of a being was not in their power or their lifespan or their ancient wisdom. It was in their capacity to care about someone other than themselves. It was in their willingness to sacrifice. It was in their stubborn and beautiful and impossibly human capacity for love. Daniel Cole had never set out to rewrite galactic history. He had simply done what he believed was right. And that had been enough. Empress Villani smiled once more at the statue of her old friend. And then she turned and walked into the sunset, carrying his memory with her as she always had and always would, until the day she joined him among the stars. And